The silent killer as devastating as climate change. The United Nations warns that the loss of biodiversity threatens humankind with extinction. I'm Adnan Nawaz, and today's newsmaker is the potential end of life on Earth. Human beings could become the first species to document their own extinction. That's the warning from the United Nations. Rarely does the international body make such dramatic claims. Ecosystems are collapsing and killing the world's wildlife. Without them, the lack of clean water and food would threaten the existence of humanity. There is still time to save ourselves, and the UN's biodiversity chief is urging governments to take action to protect the planet. But they must do it now. Andrej Babis reports.
Are we living in another age of mass extinction? Conservationists say not enough is being done to protect the Earth's biodiversity. This includes animals, plants, and ecosystems. The World Wildlife Fund says since 1970, around 60% of all mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles have been wiped out, and that this rate of loss has only ever happened during mass extinctions. United Nations members are meeting in Egypt this week to try to find solutions. And the Convention on Biological Diversity wants to draft a new deal to protect plants and animals by 2020. But is that too ambitious?
This is now at the point where, as people, we've got to take a choice. Are we going to let this continue? Are we going to do something about it? Globally, at the moment, we are completely failing to tackle the loss of nature on the planet, and that's got to stop now.
The last two agreements have done nothing to control what scientists say is the worst loss of life since dinosaurs went extinct. 8 years ago in Japan, member states agreed on 20 targets. These included cutting the loss of natural habitats in half and ensuring sustainable fishing in all waters. But many targets haven't been met. Unlike climate change, there seems to be less political commitment to preventing the extinction of species. Few world leaders attend summits on biodiversity, and the United States has never ratified the Convention on Biodiversity and only sends an observer to its summits. The UN says in the next 30 years, climate change and population growth will speed up the loss of biodiversity. It says by 2050, Africa will lose half of its birds and mammals, and Asian fisheries will collapse. So if nations are already falling behind on targets, what hope is there that any new ones will be met? And what can be done to reverse the loss of biodiversity before it reaches a point of no return? Andrej Babis, The Newsmakers.
Now, joining me from Brighton in the United Kingdom is Dave Golson. He's a professor of biology at the University of Sussex. And in Toulouse in France, we have Stuart Pym, the Doris Duke Chair of Conservation Ecology at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. And Stuart is also president of the non-profit group Saving Species. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. Let's first of all take this assessment from the United Nations that the way things are going, humankind itself is facing extinction. Is that over-dramatic? Is it alarmist, or is it realistic? Stuart?
It's too dramatic. It's not realistic. Are we going to go extinct? No. Are there many of things that we can do in Britain, in the United States, in Turkey, around the world? Yes. But saying dramatic things that are going to be proven to be silly in a decade's time doesn't really help us very much.
Dave, a decade's time may be a very short time frame, but if we extend that time frame to longer, would that assessment from the United Nations be correct in your assessment?
I agree with Stuart in that I don't think we're going to drive ourselves extinct anytime soon. But I think we're making life much harder for future generations, that we're going to hand over the world in a rather sorry state. And it's very likely that much of the world's biodiversity will be gone, and that it will be harder for future generations of people to make a living without the services that wildlife provides to us, and without a healthy environment.
Why is biodiversity that important to the planet? After all, hasn't it been the nature of the world as it is over 4 billion years old that no species really ever, as far as I understand, has lived forever? Everything eventually has gone extinct. Isn't that just the way of the world? Why is biodiversity right now so important? Both of you, but Dave first of all.
So there's no doubt at all that we are driving biodiversity, reducing the world's biodiversity. Species are going extinct at, we don't really know how fast, but we know it's much faster than the average historical rate. That we are essentially creating the sixth mass extinction event that Earth has seen. And it's true that species all go extinct eventually. Mankind will go extinct at some point, I'm sure. Whether that's sooner or later is hard to predict. But I would say that it's really foolish of us to wipe out other species on the planet for a number of reasons. Firstly, because they might be useful to us. We know that species provide lots of services, things like pollinating our crops, which it would be hard to do without. In many cases, we don't actually know whether a species does something useful or not. And therefore, we don't know what the consequences will be of driving species extinct, whether that will lead to some catastrophic collapse of ecosystems or just a general degradation of the planet is unclear. I would argue that whether or not species are vital to our survival, we have a moral duty to look after the other species on the planet. And that also some species probably don't do anything practically useful to us. Think, for example, of butterflies. Beautiful creatures, everyone loves butterflies, but actually the majority of them, perhaps all of them, don't do anything which is vital to human survival. But butterflies are disappearing. Do we want to leave future generations a world in which they can't enjoy the beauty of butterflies, unpretty birds, and many other of the Earth's wildlife? That seems to me a really sad inheritance to leave to future generations.
Stuart?
I agree. I agree with all of that. I think all the world's major religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, many others, all have a strong sense of ethical stewardship, that we have a responsibility to future generations, but there are strong ethical concerns throughout the world. And I think we must recognize that we are not treating our biological inheritance very, very well. I think the point about butterflies is well taken, that people enjoy nature. It's part of what gives us and our children, and now my grandchildren, pleasure, and I don't want to see that destroyed. But the other piece of this is really huge, and that is that the world's protected areas bring in a substantial amount of economic good. People want to visit national parks. Turkey has exceptional biodiversity, but it's not done as good a job as other countries in terms of protecting that. Is that our areas bring in tens, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars worth of income to the communities around them, and it just makes good economic sense to look after nature.
Don't we have to look at the lifestyle of human beings? And don't we reach the conclusion that what we're doing to the planet is simply the cost of our lifestyle? Ever since industrialization happened, the way we have been advancing in our lifestyles has damaged the rest of the planet. We're almost, humans, you could say, are almost like parasites, what we're doing to the planet. Is that fair enough, Stuart?
I think the challenge, I would phrase that slightly differently. Challenge is to find ways for local communities to lead sustainable lives, to get benefit from nature, and not to destroy it senselessly in a way that precludes, how they may use it in the future. It's a management issue. We need to be careful about that. But I think there are ways forward where people can benefit. I don't really buy the idea that we are, some awful parasite. I think we're very smart. I think we're very able to make sensible decisions. But we have to, we have to make them, and we have to sit down with different sectors in society.
Dave, what's the best way to make fellow man do something positive for the planet and preserve the biodiversity that we have at the moment?
That's a very good question, and I wish I knew the answer, but there's an interesting debate to be had about this. I recently heard David Attenborough say that he thinks conservationists are a bit too doom and gloom, and that turns, although he agrees that there are enormous environmental issues and that there is a biodiversity crisis, that if we are too negative, that people turn off, that they lose interest and they go off to watch the football or do something else. He has a point, but I do think that it's vitally important that we make it abundantly clear to people just how serious these environmental issues are. It isn't just the biodiversity crisis. That's part of a whole series of interrelated environmental problems that the growing human population is creating. To give you just another example, we're eroding and degrading the world's soils at a rate of perhaps 100 billion tonnes of topsoil a year are lost. And we can't quickly or easily replace those soils. It would take tens of thousands of years. So, and there are many others. Of course, climate change is perhaps the most obvious. So we're creating this kind of interrelated storm of issues and hoping that future generations of humans can sort out the mess we're going to leave them. And so it is serious. We may not be due to go extinct anytime soon, but we are making life really hard for future generations. And so we ought to do better than that. We owe them better than that. And we need to engage with people. We need to convince them of the seriousness of this issue. At the moment, I find it really frustrating. Maybe 5 or 10% of the world's population realise that we face an environmental catastrophe, if you like, of some scale in the near future. But most people are too busy earning a living, feeding their kids, worrying about their pension or whatever, and haven't really understood that unless we do things differently. One thing I find really puzzling is that most people would do almost anything for their kids, apart from apparently leave them a healthy planet to live on. And we must do better. How we persuade everyone to take this seriously, I don't know.
Absolutely, and most people would do anything for their dog or their cat. But, you say that it's incumbent upon us. You've both spoken about the moral imperative of leaving a better planet for future generations. You both are specialists in this field, and neither of you can answer, and fair enough, you can't answer how we can persuade people to change their habits that will lead to a better planet. And there are some people who say it's never going to happen because human beings are essentially selfish. Stuart says we're not necessarily parasites, but surely it seems that most people care about their very own immediate environment and are not worried about what's going to happen in millennia to come. And we're talking about a longer term timescale here, aren't we? Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, my criticism of Sir David Attenborough is really separate from the two issues we've heard. I think the reality is that we have lots of solutions. We know that in many parts of the world, including Turkey, there is conflict between big animals, wolves and bears, and human livestock. Can we do something about that? Yes. There's a lot of things that individuals can do, what communities can do, what governments can do. And I think the problem with the wonderful movies that we get on television is that they don't talk enough about solutions. And that's really a shame, and it gives a very distorted message. I mean, many people talk about the world species going extinct 1,000 times faster than they should be. That's my work. I'm the purveyor of gloom and misery. How I get up in the morning is not to be depressed, but because of all the things that I know I can do with my partners around the world.
Dave, how frustrating is it for the scientific community when it has its findings that it shows politicians, who are the people that are elected to take action on our behalf, how frustrating is it when you then get inaction from governments? I'm going to give you one or two examples. The man who is foreign minister-elect, who will take over as part of the new Brazilian government in January, he believes that climate change is a Marxist plot that is designed to promote growth in China. In the UK, there's a new movement called Extinction Rebellion. They had a massive protest in London over the weekend. There were thousands of people there, and they say our politicians are not treating what's happening to the planet as a crisis, and that's why we're on the streets. How frustrating is it for you, who have the evidence through your research?
Enormously frustrating, of course. I think there are all sorts of reasons for it. The biggest of which is probably that most governments are very short-termist, that they're worrying about the next elections, which is usually a period of 4 or 5 years away, rather than thinking long-term and planning for decades ahead, which is, of course, what we should be doing. It's not helped by the fact that there are very few scientists in political positions. Most politicians don't have a science degree and perhaps are not well equipped to understand the problems and the magnitude of the problems that we face. I was struck by the fact that there was so little reporting of the event that you just mentioned, and generally of these environmental issues. I think I am sitting in a BBC studio, but the BBC doesn't often seem to cover environmental issues in the kind of depth and take them as seriously as they deserve, given how enormously important they are to us. So we somehow need to persuade governments to think beyond the economy and the next few years. The ultimate truth is that looking after the economy will be a waste of time if we destroy the environment, because ultimately economies will collapse if we don't have a healthy environment. But politicians don't seem to have yet quite grasped that vital point.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers. We'll leave it there. Appreciate it. Joining us from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt is the Executive Secretary of the UN Biodiversity Convention, Christiana Paschke-Palmer. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Palmer. How exactly are you framing your rallying call for the preservation of the planet's biodiversity?
Thank you very much for inviting me. Look, it is quite a rally indeed, and in many respects, it's a very grand challenge that we are embarking on here. But I am cautiously optimistic, I think, about the future. So we are here in Sharm el-Sheikh now, together with all the 196 countries that are part of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, a body that was established 25 years ago under the United Nations to get all countries around the world to commit to important actions to safeguard life on Earth. There are some good news and some bad news. So on the not so good news side, perhaps, is that despite all the efforts and the goodwill and many many programs, many initiatives, legislative action, global targets, a whole set of policies, both at the global level, but most importantly at national level, that have been implemented over these 25 years, we don't seem to be successful as a global community to really put a dent on the biodiversity loss and destruction of ecosystems. On the good news side, I think there is a bit of an awakening, and when I say that, I mean outside the usual circles of scientists and conservationists and environmental NGOs. We have seen in the last few years more interest from the business community, from political decision makers, to a certain extent from heads of state, which is quite new and which demonstrates, I think, a bit of a shift in the perception, but also an understanding that we are facing, as I think one of your previous speakers was referring to, a potential catastrophe. What we need to do, though, moving forward, is to see this movement growing rapidly. We need an acceleration of action, and we certainly need to do things differently, sometimes perhaps radically differently than we have done in the past. Now, the understanding may not be there yet with the general public or with some economic actors And that's what we are trying to do. We are trying to pass this message, to ring the bell of urgent action, because our window of opportunity as a, the smartest species, one could argue, at the top of the food chain, is rapidly closing.
Christiana Pașca-Palmer, we have to leave it there. Thank you for your time. Still to come on the programme, Europe's most powerful leaders call for their own army. But do they really need one? And protesters rally in Prague demanding the Prime Minister's resignation. Will he be forced out? French President Emmanuel-macron recently said Europe needs to protect itself from Russia, China, and even the United States. He suggested one way of doing that would be with a European army. US President Donald Trump took the comment as an insult. Then Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel chimed in, throwing her full support behind Macron, suggesting an EU army would actually complement NATO. But is that really the case? Does the EU actually need an army? Natalie Pahonen takes a look.
Does the European Union need an army? It's an idea that's been raised before, but it's now gaining traction from two of the Union's most prominent leaders. French President Emmanuel-macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel have both said the Union should establish its own military force. Macron told members of Germany's parliament that Europe has to be stronger to prevent the world slipping into chaos.
Parce qu'elle ne pourra jouer son rôle si elle-même devient le jouet des puissances, si elle ne prend pas davantage des responsabilités dans sa défense et sa sécurité, et se contente de jouer les seconds rôles sur la scène mondiale.
Merkel got a mixed reaction when she raised the proposal at the European Parliament in November.
Wir sollten, das sage ich sehr bewusst auch aus der Entwicklung der letzten Jahre, wir sollten an der Vision arbeiten, eines Tages auch eine echte europäische Armee zu schaffen.
Both leaders say Europe needs to be better positioned to defend itself. And Macron has pointed out that the Union's neighbour, Russia, has shown it can be a threat. There are many questions about what a future EU army would look like. Who would be at the top of the chain of command? Where would the headquarters be? What kind of equipment would be used? And who makes the decision about deploying troops? One thing Merkel has stressed is that any European force would be a complement to the NATO alliance. Many EU nations are already a part of NATO, and the idea of a European army hasn't been well received by the United States, one of NATO's key members. US President Donald Trump has criticised Macron's support for it, tweeting a message to pay for NATO or not. Trump has repeatedly demanded other members of the alliance commit to spending at least 2% of their GDP on their militaries. Which raises another question: how will any future EU army be funded? Merkel and Macron's vision for an integrated European force won't become a reality anytime soon. But is it a military strategy that needs to be considered in the first place? Natalie Pahonen, The Newsmakers.
OK, let's go to our panel. We're joined from Warsaw by Dominik Tarczynski. He's a member of Poland's parliament for the ruling Law and Justice Party and a member of the European Affairs Committee. In Vienna, political analyst and opinion writer Klaus Jürgens is there for us. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on The Newsmakers. This is a very grand idea that has been gaining momentum over the past couple of months, primarily because of Macron and Merkel's statements. Dominik, is it a good idea or a bad idea?
It's such a stupid question, as the Donald Trump says. Obviously, I'm just quoting. It's such a ridiculous idea. How can you have an army when you're not paying 2% for NATO? I'm talking about Germany. How can you have a European army when you're selling warships, Mistrals to Russians? How can you have an army when you cannot cope with your own problems? It's just a way to change the subject. Angela Merkel is trying to get another idea to make us discuss it. It's such a ridiculous idea. Why she's not paying 2%? Why she's spending money for illegal immigration? Poland, even though we are having a deficit, we are paying 2%, as we should, as a members of NATO. She's not paying 2%. Poland is about to pay 2.5%. And I can't really understand the whole idea of discussing it. And the same Macron, when he won election, he says that he wants to change European Union with Germany. Oh, we can see how they are trying to change European Union. Angela Merkel is not paying 2%, and she's building Nord Stream 2 with Putin. And Mr. Macron is attacking Mr. President, Donald Trump, and then selling Mistrals to Russia. Such a bunch of hypocrites.
Okay, just quickly, Dominic, is this your party opinion, your political party's opinion, or your own personal analysis?
Well, this is my opinion, but you can hear it from many conservatives in Europe. It's not like this is something unusual. What I've said was very simple. They are not paying for NATO. That's the fact. They are selling their Mistrals warships to Russia. That's the fact. They do not pay 2%. They cooperate with Russia, and they want to have a new subject because Angela Merkel is stepping down. She already announced it. She's not going to run. She lost election. People hate her. I'm really sorry to say that, but you can see this on the streets. We've got Bastille days in France when you've got 900 cars burned. In the same time in Poland, you've got over 250,000 people marching on Independence Day, and there's no one piece of paper on the street. That's the difference between our societies now. We are calm, we are open, we are peaceful, and they are having riots, and they are having this cooperation with Russia, which is just a fact.
Okay, Klaus, that's a very firm opinion there expressed by Dominic in Warsaw. Is there another side to the story? Is there any popular support for this idea?
Well, I think we have to go back a little bit in history. The idea behind having a European defense mechanism or a European army is nothing new. The German Minister for Defense only mentioned this morning that basically it started 1954, was scrapped 1958, but lingered on, always in the minds of those who say we need a closer European cooperation, more integration. Then common foreign and security policy came about, but without a proper army. So this is one dimension we have to take into account. Secondly, I think with Angela Merkel having said that she is resigning in December from her party post, at the same time not running again as Chancellor, it seems understandable from her perspective that she says she wants to have a certain legacy, a legacy perhaps which is somewhat dimmed in Germany for the time being, so go to Europe. Now, what can you achieve in a post-Brexit Europe? Many people say this common European house is in great difficulties. What do we do? Could there be another, not a Brexit, but another capital letter and someone else is leaving? So asking now to foster European integration by pushing for a European army, not without NATO, but within NATO, I think could be a clever move. Would the Germans support it? We heard the European Parliament debate a few days ago, and there was a lot of shouting and interrupting, but basically from extremist sides, not from her own party colleagues or from the moderate opposition. So I think there is a fair chance, if she proposes it together with Macron, as she did. It will take years. It will take maybe 4, 5, 6 years, if not longer. But if the process has started, I think there could one day be a stronger European coordination within NATO. I think this could be a roadmap, 50% success, and I believe a majority in Germany would actually support her.
Dominic, you're laughing.
Yeah, because it's just a joke. The only legacy which will stay after Angela Merkel, the legacy is just rape, killings, This is what we have now with illegal immigrants.
Okay, Klaus, we just lost the connection with Dominic. Is it fair to say that actually at this stage already you're implying that it's going to take some time, which is natural, that the idea is very much just in the early stages, because Macron and Merkel haven't really spoken about the composition of this EU army, who would lead it, where it might be deployed, whether only within the EU, whether outside, who would make those decisions, under what sort of circumstances it may operate. All of these details, they're not known. So it's just this Merkel and Macron proposing the idea with a look to the future, but also bearing in mind what's happening at the moment with an increasing number of Eurosceptic governments around the European Union.
Yes, I think this is a very, very fair analysis. You cannot expect anything, definitely not in or after the meeting in Brussels. Commentators said that the actual issue of a European army would more or less be on the sidelines today, but it will be mentioned. Now, what Mrs. Merkel said in her speech and afterwards was that initially she can imagine that there would be a humanitarian dimension, rescue operations, that there would be joint training exercises, step by step perhaps leading to a full-fledged army. But she is very well aware of Realpolitik à la Deutschland. This will take quite a long time. But if the ball gets rolling, and we shouldn't forget, there is this certain uneasiness with the Trump administration and whether the Europeans should not take more matters into their own hands, including defense. And this public sentiment could very well open the door to seriously discuss what could a European army within NATO actually achieve. Mrs. Merkel said we have at present 150 to 160 different weaponry systems, machinery systems, paperwork systems, education and training systems, different tanks, different everything, whereas compared to America's only 50 to 60. There is another dimension linked to it, which is a huge cost-saving factor, which will always go down well with the public vote. Secondly, if I may very briefly, now France and Germany proposing something like this together, having been fierce enemies for so long, and then helping to create a peaceful Europe, this is something else which will go down very well with the public both in France and in Germany. Why not safeguard this peace even more by jumping, by going the final step and suggesting a European army? So I think there is much more to it, instead of only hoping that Mrs. Merkel would have a short-term European legacy because things at home went a little bit awry. I think if this is really discussed in seriousness, this could pave the way for a fully fledged common foreign and security policy, the capital S then leading to a European army. But it will not take ages, but it will take a long, long time. I think at the moment 26 EU member states are seriously interested in at least discussing it. But would they really go so far to drop national interests, to drop part of their national history, legacy? It is very difficult even trying to create a joint command structure. But by all means, why not discuss it? I am neither 100% in favor, neither 100% against. It is something, if it helps Europe to safeguard peace in a post-Brexit world. Why do I link it? Because Europe is worried what will happen next. By all means, I would give it the benefit of the doubt, and I think a majority of the people in France and Germany, with all modesty said, would do so too.
It's very interesting that, having asked you about whether this might be a reaction to Eurosceptic governments that have been recently elected in the past few years in the European Union, you mentioned the Trump administration. And of course, we all know that both Merkel and Macron have spoken about now the unreliability of the United States as a key ally, specifically because of Donald Trump. But when you look historically, that military alliance that is NATO has been absolutely critical, not only to peace in Europe, but also working around other countries in the world, namely Afghanistan, for example. Would it not possibly be more prudent for Angela Merkel and Emmanuel-Macron to sit tight and wait for the end of Donald Trump's term in office, whether that's another 2 years or whether it be another 6 years?
Yes, you are absolutely correct. I mentioned the Trump dimension. Yes. Now, I would, with all modesty again, say there is the Trump dimension, and sitting it all out, playing the waiting room game might be more prudent. But at the same time, I am not 100% certain whether the Trump factor is the 51% factor. I think what you mentioned before, that there are populist movements in Europe, that there are extreme parties coming to power, at times even sharing governments. I think this is what worries Macron and Merkel much more, not only from their own political survivor's instinct, but how do European societies develop anyway? Now, I think Trump is very helpful coming in to say we need more European independence, we need a stronger Europe, we can't rely 100% perhaps on what comes from Washington. We don't agree with some of the policies, sanctions, you have it, you name it. But at the same time, you have to stem the populist tide in and within European Union member states. Now, with Britain leaving, some argue, could there be a resurgence towards the far right, towards extreme parties, even more than we see it today? How can we hold this house, Europe, together? So why not propose a completely new set of policies which were sidelined up until now? Why not suggest a European army to help building this house, Europe, with an even more solid foundation? I think we have the Trump dimension, as you mentioned, but I think it is the 51% of trying to bring Europe back on track, and Trump would be 49%.
Yes, but what about the danger?
I think it's a very, very strong European dimension.
Sure, but what about the danger of this EU army potentially undercutting NATO? And then, exactly as we've heard, the arguments about most European countries who are members of NATO not paying that 2% of their GDP, not spending that amount on defense. Why not increase the amount up to 2%, which was agreed a few years ago that NATO members would have to do that? Even Germany doesn't do that. There are very few. In fact, the United States, the UK, Greece and Estonia, believe it or not, are the only 4 countries that actually do that who are members of NATO. Why not concentrate on NATO, a tried and trusted military alliance that has the backing of the world's greatest military, which is still an ally of Europe?
That's a very good question. I think reading between the lines, what political commentators sometimes may do, coming back one time to the uneasiness about some things which emanate from Washington, what the European public more or less agrees on is that there is peace in Central Europe, and that this peace should be guaranteed and safeguarded. Now, with a stronger European vocation, and Merkel and Macron and the German and the French as the renewed engine, in particular after London will have left very, very shortly. Now, there are 2 superpowers, two star players, so to speak, Berlin and Paris. Now, if they want to take matters into their own hands to bring this to the people, and they would probably rather say we invest into a stronger Europe within NATO instead of simply complying with the 2% formula. Why would people question a 2% in the first place? The reason is not because people do not trust NATO anymore. Some people simply argue, well, there is peace, at least within Europe, so what will NATO's role be in a wider world? And why should individual EU member states talk about this and talk about that? Why do we not talk with one voice? And exactly here lies the problem. Will those EU member states ever talk about one voice with regards to defense? I think if we have a new program 4 to 5 years from today, we would probably still discuss it. So I think it's a work in the making. People are worried about spending too much money on defense. People want to spend money differently. Elections in Bavaria showed it. It is all about the individual. It is about ecological issues. It is about everything but asking, are we safe? Is our national security threatened by a foreign attack? None of this, of course, features anymore. And what about German-French friendship? Now, after the Second World War, and I'm part of this baby boomer generation, our parents still were not extremely happy about it. And they said, wow, look, how has all this changed? Former enemies became friends. I do see this very strong Franco-German dimension in all of this, safeguarding and promoting peace for good and forever. And then I think Europeans would perhaps even say, okay, now we actually are ready to pay the bill. For the time being, I think asking that NATO will be provided with more funds, I think it's very risky if you go to the next elections. So I don't want to divide NATO from this idea, which is a blueprint for the future, perhaps. But there is no dissentiment about NATO. No one wants to leave NATO, as far as I'm concerned. But people are questioning whether Europeans could not even take some of these defense issues into their own hands. And could they not even do it better? You know, this old joke, when I want to talk to Europe, whom do I call? Now, this question would be over. There would be one joint command structure. But setting up a joint command structure will take years. And this is a modest understatement.
Klaus, really appreciate it. Klaus Jürgen speaking to us from Germany about this idea of Angela Merkel and Emmanuel-Macron about an EU army. Thanks for your time.
We find it unacceptable that 70 years after the communist coup and 29 years after the Velvet Revolution, a criminally prosecuted person, a secret police agent, is the Prime Minister of this country.
Last Friday, the Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babis said he would never resign. His promise reignited street demonstrations against a man who's only been in office for 11 months. The scandal-hit leader now finds himself fighting for his political life. Babis has been accused of fraud. A new documentary features his son, who claims he, the son, was held in Crimea to prevent him from giving evidence in the case against his father. Babis denies doing anything wrong, saying his son is mentally ill and went to Crimea voluntarily. His opponents aren't buying it, neither are the thousands of people on the streets of Prague, all demanding the Prime Minister step down. I'm joined from Brussels by Vít Novotný. He is a senior research officer at the Wilfred Martens Centre for European Studies and a former candidate for the Czech Parliament. Vít, thank you very much indeed for joining us on The Newsmaker. So Babis is accused of personally taking €2 million in EU subsidies, which were meant for small businesses. People are on the streets. They want him to step down. But where's the presumption of innocence while the case against Babis continues?
Of course, I'm glad to be on this program. Thank you very much for inviting me. Of course, Babis is no normal, ordinary person. He's one of the highest politicians in the country. So the presumption of innocence does not apply in his case. He's been connected to financial fraud, and this is a serious matter for Czech politics.
What is his base? Who are the people who are still supporting him?
It's a mixture of voters who formally adhere to other parties, namely the Social Democrats, but to some extent also the center-right Eurosceptic Civic Democrats and other parties.
He says he won't resign, but there looks as if later in the week there's going to be a motion of no confidence in him in Parliament. There'll be a vote. Presumably, with this declaration that he won't resign, he's challenging Parliament to go through with that vote, but he must have done the mathematics that he can win. Do you think he can?
I think he can. The mathematics at the moment looks pretty much like he will remain Prime Minister, because the majority in the lower chamber just isn't there to depose him.
Are the calls for him to step down as much about his 11 months as Prime Minister as they are about this case? Because as we say, the case continues. He hasn't been found guilty of anything yet. But is his record as Prime Minister another reason that people are on the streets saying you must resign?
I personally don't think so. I think this is really connected to the personality of Mr. Babis as opposed to his record as a politician. The protests are related to his financial dealings, to his alleged past as an agent for the communist police, and also his dominant position on the Czech media market. He owns the country's two largest dailies. He's bought radio stations, television stations, and other media. And so the concern is more over his suitability to serve as prime minister, as opposed to his record as a prime minister and previously as finance minister in the previous government.
The way you describe him, Vit, he sounds like a Czech Silvio Berlusconi. Is that anywhere near the mark?
It's near the mark, in my opinion. He cuts a similar figure to Berlusconi, and indeed there are a number of parallels between Czech and Italian politics. He's a self-made man, like Berlusconi. He's an eclectic ideologue who doesn't like political programs, like Berlusconi. And indeed, he is using his base in the media to try to dominate the country's politics.
What is the good and bad in terms of what he's achieved since he became prime minister, his main achievements, and what do his opponents say are his main failings?
To some extent, in a paradoxical manner, he has restored trust in, and this sounds strange, but he has restored trust in politics in the sense that he's somebody who many people can relate to. He speaks people's language. He doesn't use the smooth, polished talk that other politicians use. He prefers handing out donuts to people as opposed to writing political programs. So in that sense, he's somebody who relates to people on the human level, so to speak. He's done some good things, such as improving tax collection, and he is competent in some manner. Which is something that people would not say about some of his predecessors.
This claim from his son, Andrej Babis Jr., that his father wanted him out of the way of the criminal inquiry, and that the son says he was given a choice. You can take an extended holiday or I'll lock you up in a mental home. How credible is the son?
We simply don't know. His son is somebody who almost everybody says suffers from schizophrenia. And if that's true, then indeed it will be doubtful whether he is a credible witness, although I'm not trying to say that somebody with schizophrenia always lies. This just simply has to be assessed, and we don't have that objective assessment at all. There are just speculations around there, around the son and around the son's movement, whether he has been taken to Crimea and then Ukraine against his will or with his consent. These things are contested, we don't know.
How do you think this is going to resolve itself? Let's say he wins the no confidence motion in Parliament. Will it continue? Is there some kind of resolution to this? Will he just ride it out and people will forget about it?
The way it looks today, he may ride it out, providing his coalition partners continue supporting him. The big question is over the stance of one of the junior coalition partners, the Social Democrats. They are currently debating internally about their next steps. But they are aware that if they vote, if they leave the government and then vote against Mr. Babis, they might be replaced by the far-right SPD party, which is a xenophobic formation on the Czech political scene, which currently sits in the opposition. So this even a vote of non-confidence might result in Mr. Babis staying in power or simply exchanging one coalition partner for another.
And then we'll wait to see what the case against him finds, guilty or not guilty. Let me put a general question to you, Vit. The Czech Republic has been independent in its current form as the Czech Republic since the dissolution of Czechoslovakia since 1993. Andrej Babis is the 12th Prime Minister in those short years. Take away Václav Klaus, who became Prime Minister just before independence. The average lifespan of a Prime Minister in the Czech Republic is 700 days. Does that mean that there's something wrong with Czech politics?
Yes, it's a very short time span. We could debate for a long time for what the reasons are for this, but I can certainly confirm that over the past 15 years, the Czech governments have been very unstable, and this has been given by the volatility which reflects itself in the composition of the lower chamber. In addition, I feel Czech political parties are not well rooted in society, and their voter base is often unstable and floating, and they often don't have a strong foundation to refer to, and this creates a behavior among political elites which is often self-serving, and often they are perceived correctly in many cases as small cliques which are not able to govern for the wider good.
Vit Novotny, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Adnan Nawaz. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, has the British government inflicted great misery on its people with its controversial austerity measures? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.